he is coming back as Israel's warrior king. Remember the first time he came as a lamb to give himself as a sacrifice for sin? He's coming back the second time as a warrior king. To do what? To defeat all of the historic persecutors of his people through human history. All of the historic persecutors are the same nations that today are rising again, will unify in the last days. I believe will form an Islamic caliphate, and one individual will step forward and he will rule over those 10 nations and attack Israel in the last days. I want to share with you, just try to kind of encapsulate it in a nutshell to give you a sense of the importance and what's happening in this area right here, okay? You need to understand that there are many forces at work in terms of the Middle East. It's like untangling a big bowl of spaghetti. You pull one piece and it's connected and interwoven with so many other components and pieces in the Middle East. So to try to unravel it all and understand it's very difficult. But I will tell you to focus on two main issues or developments that is taking place and has been taking place historically and right now, and I think in the future, that will help you understand the movement of events taking place. One is the issue of the conflict between the two main aspects or versions or schools of thought as it relates to Islam. Sunni Islam and Shia Islam. Okay, that's one component because that is the driving force of Islamic nations over here in terms of what they're doing and why they're behaving the way that they're behaving in. So there is a major conflict within Islam between the two main arms of Islam, if you will. Sunni Islam, which is about 80 to 85% of the Islamic world, and that's centered in Saudi Arabia. So the center or headquarters of Sunni Islam, and Sunni and Shia Islam, by the way, it's basically a difference of thinking as it relates to who should be ruling over the Islamic world. Is it the bloodline of Muhammad, or is it an individual who should rule over Islam that is essentially put there in place like a king almost would be put in place? Sunni believes one thing, Shia believes another, and since the death of Muhammad in 632 AD, since his death, you have the Islamic world that has really moved in these circles between Sunni and Shia Islam, these two divisions or two arms within Islam. The center of Sunni Islam, which is about 80 to 85% of the Arab Muslim world, is Sunni Islam, and that's centered in Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia. Now, the Shia Islam, or the Shiites, that is about 15% or so, 15 to 20% of the Islamic world. And that is centered, but we're still talking about hundreds of millions of people. So don't think 15% now, it's not very many. It's still a major population, okay? That is centered or headquartered in Iran, okay? So Sunni Islam, centered in Saudi Arabia, and Shia Islam, centered in Iran. Those two nations are diametrically opposed. They are mortal enemies of each other. Don't just lump all of Islam and all those nations in together when you're over in the West and you say, oh, it's Islam, so we just throw them all into one big pile. They're very distinct. They have very different objectives. They're unified on some things from the Islamic perspective, but in terms of their history, their nations, their objectives, their goals, it's very different. These are mortal enemies, Saudi Arabia and Iran, and you have to know that. They sit right across from each other, right across the Persian Gulf from each other. They have different objectives. So that is one component that you need to understand. The other component is the Muslim Brotherhood. You've heard of an organization called the Muslim Brotherhood. That is also a very significant component or organization that is at work throughout the Muslim Arab world in the Middle East, the Muslim Brotherhood. Now let's set that aside for the moment and focus on Sunni and Shia Islam. And specifically, I want to focus on Shia Islam, which is centered in Iran. Okay? So where is Iran from where we're standing? To the east. So if you're looking up here at Mount Hermon, let's say that's pretty much to our north. Okay? So we're talking about Iran over this way. Okay? From the east. Now, Iran Iran, which is ancient what? Persia. Ancient Persia, okay? Changed its name not that long ago to Iran. Iran has said, its leadership has said, which is the center again of Shia Islam, has said that it wants to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Iran is developing nuclear weapons. That's one of the big things with Barack Obama in the United States, and whether we were going to do a deal, which he did, with Iran, and to try to oversee or to kind of govern to some degree the amount of progress that Iran could make towards developing its nuclear program. And Iran says it's for peaceful means, for energy, and Israel, of course, it has evidence, clear evidence, and so does America, that it's not for peaceful purposes. They're trying to develop nuclear weapons in Iran. So Prime Minister Netanyahu exposed that through a lot of Israeli intelligence, an amazing discovery over in Iran. It's clear that Iran has made no bones about it. They want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Iran, which is ancient Persia, wants to reestablish the greatness of the Persian Empire. Remember, these nations don't think in terms of 5, 10, 20 years. They think in terms of hundreds of years, centuries. They think in terms of centuries of time. Okay, so they're planning and strategizing for their ultimate goal. Now, what has Iran done in recent times? What are they doing? First of all, they have a large source. They share a large source of natural gas in the Persian Gulf. So think about the Persian Gulf. You know that there's a lot of oil that's exported out of there. But one of the largest discoveries of natural gas in the world is shared by Qatar, which is a tiny peninsula in the Persian Gulf next to Saudi Arabia, and Iran. It's in the middle of the Persian Gulf, down underneath, and Iran and Qatar share this huge source of natural gas. Qatar has gotten very wealthy from it. Iran has made lots of money off of it too. That's why you have the sanctions that are going on that President Trump and the United States are trying to impose on Iran to cripple their energy exports, to squash those energy exports so that they cannot do what with the money that they're making? Fund terrorism. Yeah. Okay, Iran is one of the largest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. They are sponsoring proxy terrorist groups throughout the Middle East. Now, so we're starting in Iran. They're the source of this. When they're selling the natural gas from the energy exports, they have lots of money to fund their proxy terrorist groups and to increase their military strength in the region. So when America was in Iraq and deposed Saddam Hussein, and then we left, there was a vacuum left in Iraq. Who filled the vacuum, and who is trying desperately to fill the vacuum? Iran is. So Iran has moved into and controls a lot of what's done and said and thought and decisions that are made in the capital of Iraq, which is Baghdad. So you have Iran over in the distance. A little bit closer to us is Iraq and Baghdad. So Iran has significant influence in the capital city of Iraq, which is Baghdad. But they're not happy just to have that. They've also moved into Syria, which is a little closer, a little bit to the north, and a little closer to us, all the while moving towards the west. Okay? So now Iran also has and has had significant control and influence in the capital city of Damascus, right? Damascus, Syria, which we said is just on the other side of Mount Hermon, on the other side of Israel's portion of Mount Hermon. Okay, and part of Mount Hermon is in Israel. The left side you see, the right-hand side, the taller part is in Syria. So nestled kind of down to the right, in front of the bigger snow areas, would be Damascus. Okay, only 20 miles away or so. All right, from where we are. So Iran has a lot of influence, power, in the capital city of Syria, Damascus. And also, for many years, Iran has been funding, now we're moving further to the west, also close to the border here where we are, in Lebanon, the capital city of Beirut. And they fund a proxy organization called Hezbollah, located in southern Lebanon, again, right on Israel's border. So here's what you have. You have to visualize it, think in terms of a map. You have Iran selling energy, selling natural gas, and making lots of money from it. And from those finances, they're funding terrorism. And they're moving their military assets closer to Israel. They have influence in the next country closer, Iraq, in Baghdad. And then the next country closer, Syria, and specifically the capital city of Damascus. And in Beirut, Lebanon. What have they done? They have created what's known as the Shia Crescent. The Shia Crescent is an area, an arc, if you will, from Iran through the land areas of the nations we just mentioned, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. A path to the Mediterranean Sea, which is critically important for them and for their strategy. Now that's on the northern front with Israel. And what are they doing in Syria? They are moving assets, military assets, closer and closer to Israel's border, right here, where we are, between the Golan Heights and Syria itself. So, do you think it makes sense that President Trump said, you know what? Israel has annexed this area that it took over when the Syrians controlled it up until 1967. Israel took it over. Israel, in a defensive posture to protect itself when the Syrians were attacking, Israel rebuffed the attack in 1967 in the Six-Day War and took the Golan Heights. Now, do you think it makes sense, since it's the high ground and the high plateau, and when the Syrians had it, they were bombarding and shelling Israeli farm communities down below in the Hula Valley for all those years? Does it make sense for Israel to just arbitrarily give it back? When you have Syria, which is still hostile to Israel, and you have Iran, which has said publicly that Israel is a cancerous tumor that must be eradicated, and that we must wipe Israel off the face of the earth? How much sense would it make for Israel to give back such a strategic area when Iran is moving military assets close to Israel's border, and they've said we want to wipe Israel off the map? It would be insane. So President Trump understands that, and understands that's non-negotiable for Israel at this point. It was in times past. Israel had toyed with the idea of giving it back for peace, for a real peace with Syria.
A lot of political pressure.
But at this point, President Trump has said, we recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. A huge, courageous, important step to help Israel to solidify what they have here in the Golan Heights, to protect themselves so that Israel can have secure borders. Okay? So this is very important. Now, what else is Iran doing to surround Israel? In all the way down at the southern end of the Arabian Peninsula, south of Saudi Arabia. And incidentally, is Saudi Arabia friendly with Iran? No, they're mortal enemies, remember? One is Shia, one is Sunni. So Iran is not only surrounding Israel with military assets, they're surrounding Saudi Arabia as well. And Saudi Arabia knows it and is very worried. There's a choke point called the Strait of Hormuz. And Iran has threatened to close it or disrupt shipping, which can impact and blackmail the whole world because of the price of fuel can go up if Iran can create problems at the Strait of Hormuz, which is a choke point at the end of the Persian Gulf. Well, the same thing is true at the end of the Red Sea, another narrow body of water that flows from Egypt and Israel through the Sinai, along the Sinai Peninsula, all the way down to Yemen. And there is another choke point at the southern end of the Red Sea called the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. That's a narrow choke point, and again, Iran understands this, and Iran has been funding the Houthi rebels in Yemen to create problems down in Yemen, to take over Yemen. That's their effort. That's what they're trying to do in order to have a strategic location close to that other choke point in the Red Sea. Why? Because 25% of the world's energy flows through the Red Sea up to the Suez Canal in Egypt and to the Mediterranean Sea. If you're a shipper and a trader in Asia and you need to get your goods by sea to Europe, you must use the Red Sea. You must bring it across to the entrance of the Red Sea, go past that choke point that I mentioned, come up the Red Sea, up the Suez Canal in Egypt, to the Mediterranean Sea, and off to Europe. It's a critical choke point. So Iran understands this, and Iran is funding rebels in Yemen to create problems down there, and also to be able to have a beachhead to attack Saudi Arabia at some point as well. Where else is Iran funding proxies? Proxy terrorist organizations.
Muslim Brotherhood.
Gaza. The issue where Israel has just taken in 700 missiles, rockets, because Iran is also contributing to funding Hamas and Islamic Jihad Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza. They're funding those terror groups as well, and are trying to smuggle weapons into them as well. Another component, another location, which is attempting to surround Israel with military assets. This is what Iran is doing. Now, it's important to know, and I'm not going to get into all the details because of time, except to tell you that Iran, that's their strategy, and you can see it coming together right now. I mean, it is right before our eyes. But they're going to come in conflict with another country, I think, in the coming days. And that country is to our north, and that country is Turkey. Because Turkey, remember, the Ottoman Turkish Empire ruled the Middle East, predominantly the entire Middle East, all the way down through this whole region and Jerusalem, all of these other countries you talked about, up to Iran, and all the way down to Egypt, including the Muslim holy cities of Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia. The Turks controlled Mecca and Medina. They were the custodians of those Islamic holy sites. So the Turks think that they are the ones that should be ruling the Islamic world. They said from 1517 to 1917, for 400 years, the Ottoman Empire ruled much of the Middle East and controlled the Islamic holy sites of Mecca and Medina. So they say, we don't want the Saudi monarchy who's beholden to the West and doesn't really care about Islam. They're just using it for their political benefit. Turkey says, no, we are the ones who care about Islam. We are the ones that did it best for 400 years. We are the ones that should be controlling and ruling over the entire Middle East, and the Muslim world. So at some point, you may see Turkey and Iran, and where might they conflict? Syria. So you have a lot of countries and organizations that have a vested interest in what takes place in Syria. This is why you've had this Syrian conflict raging for all of these years, because Syria is geographically the area that a lot of these nations will come together. Who's going to control the region? Turkey has nowhere to expand, to re-expand to its greatness of its Ottoman Turkish Empire. It has nowhere to expand except south. It must come this way through Syria if it's going to expand. And remember, President Erdogan of Turkey, he has said categorically, our mind and our focus and our heart is towards Jerusalem. They want Jerusalem. He wants Jerusalem. This is the focus of where all of it is moving. And prophetically, we know from Scripture that that's where all of it is moving towards, is down towards Jerusalem. So you can see these nations that are flexing their muscles, that are coming together. There's going to be a conflict, whether it is in the short term or in the longer term. You're going to see these nations in conflict coming together to fight for dominance in the region. And ultimately their goal is to control Jerusalem. So, and I just want to share with you just briefly, the Muslim Brotherhood. Maybe we'll take a little bit more time at another point because we have to keep moving. But I just want to tell you that the Muslim Brotherhood is an organization that does not want to see Muslim nations ruled by autocrats or by a king, if you will. They don't want individuals ruling these nations that are these, for instance, Gaddafi in Libya. Gaddafi in Libya was overthrown. It started in Tunisia, but this Arab Spring that we talked about a few years ago, Gaddafi in Libya was overthrown. And then what happened to the ruler in Egypt? Mubarak. He was holding down the Muslim Brotherhood too. He was ruling it kind of as an autocrat. He was ruling over Egypt, holding these groups who want to push the Muslim agenda on the whole country. We're Islamic. We're an Islamic nation. But he was holding it down so that the Muslim thought the Sharia law could not overtake. But what happened? He was pushed out, and a Muslim Brotherhood ruler was put in place. Now it's flipped back again, because now you have a leader ruling Egypt who comes from their military wing. But the goal was to flip. Same thing with Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Saddam Hussein, as bad of a guy as he was, this dictator that was in Iraq, he was holding down the Muslim Brotherhood in Iraq. He was holding down this Islamic influence that wanted to control every aspect of the life of the individual who lived in that country, for Islamic purposes. He was overthrown, and what happens? You have a vacuum to which these other organizations can move in. So this is exactly what was attempted in Syria, to overthrow a leader who was holding down the Muslim Brotherhood, Bashar al-Assad. If he was deposed, you'd have a vacuum into which a Muslim Brotherhood candidate could have risen. The Muslim Brotherhood wants to see a unified Arab-Muslim world. Now, why is this so significant? Because biblically, when you're looking at Bible prophecy and you're trying to understand the rise of the Antichrist in the last days, the Bible says that the Antichrist is going to rule over a 10-nation confederation. From Daniel chapter 2, from Daniel chapter 7, from Revelation chapter 17, we see that there is a final empire that's coming into the world, that will rise upon the world. And it's going to be 10 nations that are going to unify together, and they will be ruled over by one individual known in the Bible as the Antichrist. I believe that final 10 nations, those final 10 nations, are going to be Islamic. They are all going to be historic persecutors of Israel and the Jewish people. All of these nations, these 10. These 10 nations are nations that historically, you can read in the scriptures, were nations that all came up against Israel, and they were the historic persecutors. They will join together in the last days. I believe they will be Islamic, and it will form a caliphate, a group of nations that is ruled over by Islamic law, Sharia law, both for civil and religious purposes, and one individual, the Antichrist, will rule over them. And the Bible says, in the last days, when he forms this final beast empire and rules over these 10 nations, that he and these 10 nations will come and attack Israel. And that is what is setting up the whole concept of Jesus Christ's second coming, where he will judge the nations. Remember, it says he's coming back on a white horse, clothed in white robes dipped in blood. Why? Because he's squeezing the juice from the winepress, and the blood, the grapes, if you will, from the winepress are splashing up on his robes, because he is coming back as Israel's warrior king. Remember the first time he came as a lamb to give himself as a sacrifice for sin? He's coming back the second time as a warrior king. To do what? To defeat all of the historic persecutors of his people through human history. All of the historic persecutors are the same nations that today are rising again, will unify in the last days. I believe will form an Islamic caliphate, and one individual will step forward, and he will rule over those 10 nations and attack Israel in the last days. And God will say, as his people are on their back, as the land of Israel is on its back, about to be annihilated once and for all, Israel's king will come from above and will rescue his people. There will be a remnant who will believe. They will look upon him, it says, whom they have pierced on the cross, and they will mourn as one who mourns for an only child, because they will realize that Yeshua, that Jesus Christ, was the promised Messiah. He fulfilled all of the Old Testament scriptures. He fulfilled all the prophecies. He was the promised seed from Genesis 3 who would crush the serpent's head. And Israel was the nation, and the Jewish people, we talked about this when we were in Poland with some of you. The Jewish people were sovereignly chosen by God to be the vessel through which the promised seed would come into the world that would ultimately crush Satan's head and bring redemption to the whole entire world, not just the Jewish people, but to Gentiles and everyone throughout the entire world, to offer salvation and redemption from sin and hope of eternity in heaven with God. Israel was the vessel that God chose through Abraham and his seed to be the ones that would bring salvation to the world through Jesus Christ. In Israel, there were many within Israel when Jesus Christ came that understood he was the promised seed, that understood he was the Messiah and embraced him. But the nation as a whole did not. But Satan continues, even after that first coming of Jesus Christ. Satan continues to seek to destroy the nation that gave birth to the promised seed, Jesus Christ. And we talked about the Holocaust and the issue that Satan continues the strategy to try to destroy the nation. Why does Satan continue to try to destroy Israel? Why is he going to be gathering these nations that were the historic persecutors of Israel in the last days to attack? Because Jesus Christ is coming back as the legitimate king, as the greater seed of King David, the legitimate Jewish king who will come back to rule and reign from Jerusalem, physically to the earth, to judge the nations. And there must be an Israel in existence, there must be a Jerusalem, there must be a Jewish people to which Jesus Christ will come back as king of the Jews and ultimately king of the earth. So if Satan can destroy this land and use these nations to destroy her before Jesus Christ comes back, then the prophecies cannot be fulfilled. And Jesus Christ can't be the great Jewish deliverer that was promised in the Old Testament. That is why these nations, that is why Israel has been persecuted through her history like no other nation on the face of the earth. No other people group on the face of the earth. Tiny little Israel, small little population. Why the obsession of the nations to come up continually against the land of Israel? It is because they are the vessel through which God brought the promised seed, Jesus Christ, into the world to offer redemption to all of humanity. And they are the ones to which Jesus Christ will return as King of Kings and Lord of Lords.